Good morning, everybody. Welcome to your 16th online lecture in general surgery. Today, we'll be discussing wound failure. So, wound failure is defined as when a wound fails to heal or when a wound healing is not according to the expectations of how the wound progress should take place, meaning that the healing is not uneventful, then we call it a wound failure. A good surgeon always strives to promote healing and prevent wound failure. There are two main types of wound failure or wound healing failure. One is acute wound failure and the other is chronic wound failure. The acute wound failure comprises two main elements: wound infection and wound dehiscence. Whereas chronic wound failure includes hypertrophic scar formation, keloid formation, incisional hernia formation, contractures, and ugly fibrosed scars. So we will start with acute wound failure, and the first type of acute wound failure is wound infection. This is the most common type of wound failure, and the commonest cause is contamination. This contamination with foreign material, debris, dirt, and bacteria containing foreign material can take place in the pre-operative period, at the injury site, at the roadside accident where the accident occurred, and the dust, dirt, grit, wood splinters, metal splinters, they go into the wound and contaminate the wound. Operative contamination takes place generally in 95% of the cases. It is endogenous. Endogenous means that at the time of surgery, you have opened up a viscus or a gut, and there is spillage from the fecal material or the feculent material from the gut spills over and contaminates the wound. In 95% of cases, that is generally the cause of contamination in operative wounds. Uh, Only 5% of the cases are from aerial or exogenous contamination of the wound at the time during the period of surgery while the wound is open, and especially in theaters where the uh, air circulation is not filtered or controlled, uh, and especially in prolonged surgeries, bacterial aerosols or dust flying in the air can land on the wound and cause infection. In the post-operative phase, either there is leakage from the viscera or the gut anastomosis that you've done, and that can cause wound infection, or the patient can get hospital-acquired infections or nosocomial infections. These we have discussed previously also. Uh, the hospital-acquired infections can take place if you open up the sterile dressing of the wound or in a clean, primarily closed wound too soon after surgery, and try to dress it again. Um, Wounds are not yet sealed in the first 24 to 30 hours after surgery, and they can get infected if you apply uh, hands or dressing or any antiseptics which are contaminated on wounds in this period, even in clean wounds. Then hospital acquired infections can be bloodborne. The patient is on a ventilator or IV cannulas are contaminated, or the central venous line is contaminated, and that is causing bacteremia. And those bacteria can then, of course, land up in the most inflamed part of the body, which is the surgical wound, and cause wound infection. Very little chances of aerial contamination in the post-operative period, but the first 30 hours aerial contamination, for example, the one who is doing a dressing in the post-operative period, he opens up the sterile dressing in the first 16 to 18, 20, first 24 hours, is not wearing a mask. That person who is doing the dressing may have an upper respiratory tract infection, or may be a carrier of MRSA, methicillin resistant Staph aureus, in his throat, and his breath, especially if he's talking while doing the dressing without a mask on, can then land on a wound which has not yet sealed and is not protected against aerial contamination, and that can then cause wound infection. So primarily in a clean surgery, I would suggest that you don't open the wound in the for at least 48 hours after a clean surgery, and always use sterile disposable materials for dressing. And during the first dressing, the healthcare worker must be wearing sterile surgical gloves and a mask to prevent this aerial contamination. Although the ratio of aerial contamination, as you see here, is not too high, but all precautions work towards preventing infection. As we have discussed previously, the average incidence of infection in clean wounds is 1 to 4%, in clean contaminated wounds is 5 to 15%, in contaminated wounds is 15 to 25%, and in dirty wounds the average infection rate ranges between 25 to 40% patients. So, what are the factors responsible for wound infection? These factors are divided into the causative organism related factors, host factors, and the surgery related factors. The causative organism related factors are primarily the bacterial load, or the number of bacteria that has entered the wound to contaminate it. The more the number of bacteria, or the more the types of bacteria, fecal contamination will cause multiple bacterial species of contaminants, uh, the more the chances of the host defenses being breached or overwhelmed. Then there is the second causative organism related factor is virulence of the bacteria. Even if the bacterial contamination is minimized by good surgical technique, but the bacteria which is contaminating the wound is highly virulent, like an E. coli or Pseudomonas or MRSA, then even small bacterial load can lead to wound infection if your surgery related factors are also compromised. Then we come to host factors, which are responsible for greater chances of wound infection. These include metabolic disorders, as we have discussed in wound healing, diabetes, uremia, and malnutrition. They all essential mineral deficiencies or vitamin deficiencies. All of these lead to delayed or depressed capacity to heal a wound. Immunological status of the patient, if a patient is immune compromised, or as in diabetes or uremia or malignancies or malnourishment, and that of course, or the patient is on long-term steroids, the immune status of the patient is compromised, or in HIV infections, and therefore the chances of wound infection increase. Nutrition of the patients, as I said, essential vitamins, essential minerals, and general caloric intake of the patient, because the healing of a wound requires a lot of energy, a lot of inflammation has to take place. Monocytes, macrophages have to be mobilized, fibroblasts and platelets have to go there, and then granulation tissue has to form and healing has to take place. So, nutritional requirements of patients have to be catered for. Undernourished patients have poor healing. Then in the host factors, we come to age. Infants have very small body reserves, and old age patients, the body, the blood supply is compromised because of atherosclerotic vessels and general comorbid conditions, metabolic disorders, and nutritional status, and age-related depression of the immune status. All of these combine to reduce wound healing in old age. Then there are surgery related factors. These we have already discussed in wound management in our previous lecture, but let's go through them again. Uh, Presence of dead or necrotic or devitalized. Devitalized means tissue which has lost its blood supply. The presence of dead, necrotic, or devitalized tissue in the body, in the wound, or presence of foreign material like dust, dirt, grit, cloth pieces, wooden splinters, metal splinters. They can all, if you leave them inside, and these are surgery related factors, so a surgeon is supposed to do wound lavage and wound debridement and remove all this dead material and foreign material. So if you fail to do that, then that becomes a surgery related factor, and then the potential of wound infection increases. Then comes poor surgical technique. As we discussed earlier, if you leave dead space is the space in the if you cover a wound on the surface by closing the skin, but there is a lot of space under the skin in the subcutaneous plane, above the muscles, that dead space can then be filled up with serous fluid, and that serous or blood stained blood mixed fluid is then becomes a good culture medium. Also, because the skin under surface of the skin is not approximated to the muscle or the deep fascia layer, primary healing between the two layers doesn't take place. First, that tissue space has to be covered up with granulation tissue, and granulations and serous or blood in that space, dead space, can acts as a culture medium and can become infected. Hematoma is if you either close the wound while there is still oozing of blood going on in the wound, and especially if there is a space in the deeper layers of the wound, this blood can collect and form a hematoma. A collection of blood in a wound or any part of the body is called a hematoma. And this, as we know, blood agar in the labs and chocolate agar in the labs, which is derived from blood, is used for bacterial culture. So blood is a good culture medium, and even if there is minor contamination present, in the presence of a hematoma or a dead space, the possibility of it turning into pus and an abscess is much increased. Then, as I said earlier, length of surgery, the longer the wound is open to the aerosolized dust in the air of the operation theater, aerial contamination of the wound can take place. And the longer the surgery takes, especially if the one of the surgical team is also carrying infection in their upper airway or nasal passages or the throat, and especially if uh, they are talking during the surgery, the droplets from the throat can land on the wound and cause wound infection. Then another surgery-related factor is inappropriate suture material. If you use a braided, permanent, foreign body reaction causing suture material like silk inside the body and leave it permanently inside, that suture material and its knots act as foreign material and causes inflammation, and inflamed tissues can become infected. So inside the body, dissolvable sutures should be used, and the objective should be that the suture material should be such that it does not cause foreign body reaction, and the braids and the knots do not harbor uh, bacterial colonies in them. Then we come to poor suturing technique, tissue tension. This also we have discussed in the last lecture. The tighter the tissue, the tighter the closure, the greater the tissue tension. The small capillaries in the wound edges, they become compressed, and inflammatory blood cells, the defense mechanisms, and the healing fibroblasts and macrophages, they cannot reach the wound surface, uh, and they are cut off from the actual wound a few millimeters away, because the capillaries in the wound edges are compressed. Therefore, this tissue tension, in greater tissue tension, leads to hypoxemia of the wound edges, and ultimately hypoxemic tissue is less resistant to infection, and the bacteria get a chance of growth and forming pus in that wound. Then absence of antibiotics during the decisive period. So what is the decisive period? The decisive period in clean surgery is the first 4 hours after the incision has been given. Generally, as we know, wound healing, the wound protection mechanism through inflammation, cells and body defense mechanisms, white blood cells have to be mobilized, inflammation has to take place, blood vessels in the wound edges have to dilate so that a lot of body defense mechanisms can reach the wound. But all this takes time, and the minimum time for inflammation to take place is 4 hours. Uh, the inflammation keeps on increasing and is maximum at around 12 to 14 hours, and then slowly it decreases, but the first 24 hours are very important, and the decisive period is of prime importance, that is the first 4 hours. This would also apply to roadside accidents or injuries suffered at construction sites or away from the hospital, and if the patient does not get antibiotics in a contaminated wound, the patient does not get early antibiotics, this decisive period may have been over by the time the patient reaches you, and then you have to work harder, and your lavage and wound toilet and debridement needs to be able to counter the contamination which has gone before you. So this minimum inhibitory concentration MIC90 of antibiotics should already have been reached when you give the incision. Therefore, how do we counter this decisive period is that we give IV antibiotics. The choice of antibiotics depends on the region, depends on the bacterial resistance in that hospital where you're working or operation theater where you're working, and we try to give IV antibiotics at least 20 minutes before the incision. Generally, the period prophylactic antibiotics need to be given 20 to 60 minutes before the incision is given or before the surgical procedure begins, so that MIC 90 is achieved in the blood. The minimum inhibitory concentration of the antibiotic in the blood is reached. Then, when you give an incision, even if there is minor contamination or exogenous contamination of the wound, the antibiotics in the body can fight off those bacteria and kill those bacterial colonies, prevent them from multiplying and causing pus, especially in the first 4 hours. By that time, the body's host mechanisms, defense mechanisms also become activated, and they can then join the antibiotics in this fight to kill the contaminants. So how do you prevent wound infection? There's one way is to mechanically reduce the bacterial load. The second is wound debridement. Third is prophylactic antibiotics. How do you mechanically reduce bacterial load in a contaminated or a clean contaminated wound? That is by lavage. You wash the wound thoroughly with copious amounts of normal saline, sterile normal saline, and mechanically wash out all the contaminants and the foreign material from the wound, and thus reduce the bacterial load in the wound. Second is you do adequate wound debridement. Skin, muscle, and deep fascia can be debrided uh, copiously. They can be cut out and removed. All contaminated things can be removed, but the vital tissue like nerves and blood vessels and bone need to be protected. Then, as I said earlier, prophylactic antibiotics. You must give prophylactic antibiotics even when you're going to do a wound toilet or lavage or a wound debridement or any clean surgery. These must be given 20 to 40 minutes before surgery, and you can repeat them 4 hours after the first incision, in the time of the incision. And if you think it is a contaminated or a clean contaminated or a dirty wound, then you can continue with the broad spectrum antibiotic or a combination of multiple antibiotics in the post operative period to prevent wound infection or pus from developing. The second type of acute wound failure is wound dehiscence, and we define a wound dehiscence as when the edges of the wound spread apart or break apart in the healing phase. Instead of joining together, the wound gapes or the wound opens up, and with the consequences that the patient will now need another anesthesia, whether local or general anesthesia, and another surgery to for wound lavage, wound debridement, and closure of the wound. And of course, this time, because the previous stitches have cut through, the wound edges are unhealthy. You have to find a means of surgical means of mm, closing the wound, find a way of closing the wound without undue tension, because previously if the cause of the wound dehiscence was undue tension on the wound, this time again if you close the wound under tension, then there will be a problem. So you have to work out advancement flaps or rotation flaps or skin grafts to cover the wound. That of course means that the hospital stay of the patient is now prolonged, the expenses will be much more, and there is increased morbidity and increased chances of mortality whenever a patient has wound dehiscence. The cause of wound dehiscence is generally either impaired collagen synthesis, which may result from malnutrition or metabolic disorders, or lack of essential vitamins and minerals in the body, in the host body, or there can be increased collagenase activity or increased collagen destruction. This generally occurs when the contaminating bacteria are producing a lot of collagenase, and all the body's efforts at healing the wound are being countered by the bacterial colonies secreting collagenase and destroying the collagen that is being formed. Therefore, the healing does not take place whenever the bacterial activity overwhelms the body's host healing immunity activity. Then the wound dehiscence takes place. And then again, selection of inappropriate suture material and type of closure, closure under tension, leaving hypoxemic wound edges, and inappropriate suture material which causes a foreign body reaction in the host body and may then act as a nidus of wound infection where bacterial colonies can grow. So, how do you prevent wound dehiscence? The methods and choices of closure are important, as we've discussed previously. The closure should be tension free, the suture material should be correct choice. Monofilament sutures are especially the ones which can be removed on the outer surfaces, and the ones which dissolve by themselves on the inside may be a good choice. However, the suture material choice depends on surgeon's experience and availability of the required suture material. Then prevention of infections, lavage, wound toilet, debridement, giving antibiotics, antibiotic cover. Uh, in clean surgeries, a single broad spectrum antibiotic may be enough. But in dirty wounds or where the feculent or fecal contamination has taken place, then a single antibiotic may not be the best choice. Then you have to give combinations like third generation cephalosporin, combine it with aminoglycosides like gentamicin or amikacin, and add aerobic cover with metronidazole or thereby you would be giving three antibiotics to cover the whole spectrum from aerobic, gram positive, gram negative, and microaerophilic and anaerobic organisms. So it all depends on the surgeon's assessment of the situation and prevention of whatever he decides to prevent infection in that specific situation. You must ensure good local perfusion. That good local perfusion would mean good state of hydration of the patient, good urine output, good hemoglobin levels in the body, adequate blood maintenance of adequate blood pressure in the body, and then of course closure without tension. Antibiotics we've discussed, and then you have to enhance the general condition of the body. Generally, wound dehiscence takes place in seriously ill, debilitated, malnourished patients over who have not been able to take adequate caloric or protein intake for certain period of time because of the nature of their injury or illness, and this then may need to be compensated by giving IV albumin or IV aminovel protein supplements or fat emulsion supplements to give calories to the patient so that the body has the ability to heal a wound. Correct nutritional deficit of any kind. This includes proteins, fats, caloric intake, vitamins, and minerals. Metabolic disorders like diabetes and uremia need to be covered, and if the patient has been on long-term steroids, that would need to be covered. Abstinence from smoking. Every time a patient smokes, the carbon monoxide that is produced and that binds to hemoglobin in the body, and there is uh, microarteriolar constriction for transiently for anything from 20 minutes to an hour, and regular smoking can then reduce the perfusion of a wound edges, and may cause hypoxemia, and which may further lead to wound deterioration. Treat any comorbid states, any other multi-organ system failures in seriously ill patients. If there are other multiple organ systems which are failing, all of them need to be treated at the same time, not just the wound. In all elective cases, systemic diseases need to be treated. Any other disease, the patient may be undergoing an appendectomy or a hernia surgery, or some other surgery, or maybe doing open reduction, internal fixation, or a fracture, but the patient is suffering from rheumatoid arthritis, or pulmonary tuberculosis, or has hepatitis or HIV infection, and all of these will then affect the wound healing. Therefore, all they too have to be addressed. And then last but not the least, you need ideal OT or OR operative room conditions, which includes laminar flow, HEPA filters at the intakes, good 6 to 12 air turnovers per hour, and adequate sterilization systems, and adequate sterilization of your equipment, instruments, and dressings, and good lighting, um, and ideal equipment to maintain the good anesthesia of the patient. All of these minor factors combined together, during surgery, the patient becomes hypoxic, or the BP falls, or all of these things, or the patient wakes up coughing or vomiting due to poor anesthesia. All of these conditions then lead to wound dehiscence a few days later. So now we come to the second type of wound failure after the acute wound failure, which consisted of wound infection and wound dehiscence. Then there are chronic wound failures, and these consist of a hypertrophic scar formation, or a keloid formation, or multiple keloids formations, incisional hernias, contractures, and ugly fibrosed scars. Here you see a hypertrophic scar. This is also a hypertrophic scar. It is not a very fine line which is at the same level as the surrounding skin. This is also slightly raised above heaped up scar, but here you see the scar has widened and raised significantly. So all this is a hypertrophic scar, with the hypertrophy being more prominent in this lower part compared to the upper part. Here you see keloids in the graft that was placed to take care of neck contractures after burns, and here you see the burnt earlobe also having keloid scars. Here also you see keloids. So these are worse than hypertrophic scar. This slide is very important because it compares keloid and hypertrophic scar for a clinician, how to decide whether a scar is just a hypertrophic scar or whether it is turning into a keloid scar. Because in keloid scars, if you start injecting steroids into the scar at an early stage, you may be able to stop the keloid from progressing. Uh, Genetic factor, hypertrophic scar does not show familial tendencies, but keloid scars, the tendency to form keloidal scars is generally familial, and whereas there is no racial predominance in hypertrophic scars, keloidal scars are much more common in black races compared to white races. In hypertrophic scars, the female to male ratio is the same. However, keloid scars are more common in females. Black females tend to have more keloid formation. Hypertrophic scars generally take place in children, although they can occur at any age, but they are more common in the growing age, uh, whereas keloidal scars are more common between the ages of 10 to 30 years. Now, this is an important point. Hypertrophic scars remain within the wound borders. The wound may become stretched or widened. The scar may become stretched and widened, and the hypertrophic scar will become widened, as we saw in the example in the slide. The lower part of the wound was widened, and the hypertrophic scar was more prominent in the lower part of the wound. However, the hypertrophic scar always remains within the borders of the wound. The keloid scar, on the other hand, with time outgrows the wound area. It will grow outside and keep becoming larger than the actual surgical or the traumatic scar that was there. The surface area will keep on enlarging. Hypertrophic scars generally subside with time and slowly become flattened. They usually do not grow beyond 6 months. Keloids rarely subside by themselves, and these need to be identified early on, and injecting Kenacort into the scar tissue at regular intervals can prevent the scar from forming. Basically, the body's healing mechanism, the control system of the healing mechanism has gone astray, and once the healing has taken place, the body keeps on heaping up scar tissue and does not stop. Here the body does stop, but this takes some time to stop, up to 6 months late after the initial trauma. The healing may continue to take place, which leads to a heaped up scar, but it remains within the wound borders, and this may continue. Keloids may, the heaping up of more and more scar tissue may continue indefinitely. The hypertrophic scars are commonly seen on flexor surfaces, and the common places for keloid scar formation is the sternum, which is the commonest, the shoulder, and the face. Why do hypertrophic scars form? General consensus is that it is related to either the undue tension, tight closure of the wound, or minor infections of the wound. In case of keloid, although it may be familiar and racial and genetic tendencies, there is no specific factor known which triggers keloid scars, although the keloid scars are seen far more commonly in case of burns than in case of simple trauma. But the primary etiology or the causative agent which turns a normally healing wound into a keloidal scar is unknown. Time of growth: the hypertrophic scars do not grow beyond 6 months after the initial injury or the surgery or the trauma. However, the keloid scars may keep growing. So, generally, if there was a scar which you thought was a hypertrophic scar and you have been observing it, uh, and if that scar, one, if the scar outgrows the wound area, and two, if it continues to increase in size and surface area after 6 months, then it is a definite proof that this is a keloid, and immediate institution of injectable steroids being injected directly into the heaped up keloidal scar tissue at regular intervals may stop the keloid formation, and occasionally the keloid may also regress to some extent. Here you see a patient with burns, and all the scars, all the burnt portions, all the wounds have become keloidal. So this primarily, as I said, is more commonly seen in burns, but any trauma or wound can become keloidal, and patient characteristics, familial and genetic tendencies, and racial tendencies also play a big role. Then the third type of chronic wound failure is contracture formation. Uh, a common mistake that is made either by the patient or the healthcare workers treating the patient is that while they are striving very hard to heal the wounds, visible wounds, trying to put in partial thickness grafts and cover the wounds, uh, they forget, or the patient is not intelligent enough to understand that during this healing process, during these multiple surgeries, uh, the joints, ligaments, tendons, and muscles of the body need to be kept stretched, regularly exercised, and they need to be kept soft and nimble during the healing phase, so that once the wounds have healed, the limb, all the joints and ligaments and tendons have free mobility, and uh, contractures do not take place. So this means that rehabilitation and physiotherapy starts from day one, from the time of injury, and immediately after the surgery. Our patients have a tendency to focus on the wound and to delay the physiotherapy until after the pain has subsided or the wound has healed. There's a misconception in our people that that can be done later on, but once contractures have occurred, then it is 10 times more difficult to mobilize a contracture rather than, as compared to preventing a contracture from taking place. Then there are certain injuries like electric burns, high voltage electric burns, flame burns, where the depth of the burn is in the deeper parts of the body, where the deep fascia and muscles have also been burnt. In high voltage electric burns, the electric high heat generating electric current travels in the blood vessels, travels in the water, in the blood, and from the entry point to the exit point. Therefore, the burns may not be obvious on the outside, but inside the deeper tissues and the blood vessels, the nerves and the muscles are burnt, and there whatever you do, the patient will end up in contractures like this. Here the burn has been healed with partial thickness grafts, but the inner tendons, muscles, ligaments, tissues have all contracted because they were burnt from the inside. Then the fourth chronic wound failure is incisional hernia formation. Uh, when do we label a case as having an incisional hernia? When the layers of abdominal wall, the abdominal wall musculature below the skin disrupts. So, such cases, the overlying skin was able to heal and unite, but the underlying muscle layers, which were closed by the surgeon at the time of the original surgery, either that closure was too tense, too tight closure, the stitches cut through at some later stage, because the stitches may be a very strong material, but the flesh and the aponeurosis is definitely has a certain weakness, certain threshold at which the stitches will cut through and come out of the tissue, cut through the flesh. So, in tight closures, please remember the objective in any surgery is just to approximate the two surfaces together where you want the healing to take place. The objective is not to tie them uh, together with a rope or a steel wire, uh, because that compromises the blood supply at the edges and the stitches can cut through. Similarly, in abdominal wounds, uh, poor anesthesia technique may lead to severe cuffing because of the endotracheal intubation. Even after the endotracheal tube is removed, during surgery or recovery phase, sometimes the anesthetists make your patient too light, too early. You're still closing the wound, and the patient is half awake and starts coughing, and your deeper layers become compromised, and the stitches in the deeper muscle layers start coming cutting through. Or the patient may have vomiting in the post-operative period because of the strain on the abdominal muscles, the stitches cut through, or because of the primary pathology, the patient may develop paralytic ileus or huge distension in the gut, which then strains the stitches on the muscle layer, and those stitches cut through. Similarly, minor infections in the deeper layers can make the muscles or the aponeurosis weak, and the stitches can cut through, whereas the superficial wound may drain pus for a few days and still heals with your antibiotic cover. But the deeper layers have gaped, and now there is an opening in between the muscles. Here in the midline, the rectus abdominis, the two recti were approximated, but they have cut through, and now the gut can be seen protruding outside the abdominal muscle wall, and now these abdominal contents are visible under the skin. So this is an incisional hernia. Here is another example of an incisional hernia. You see this laparotomy scar. Here the muscles gaped in a small portion, and the abdominal contents or the gut have formed a sac underneath the skin onto one side. And once the abdominal contents protrude through that muscle gap, then whenever the patient coughs, this will bulge, and when if you put a hand on it and ask the patient to cough, so you will feel the cough impulse under your hand, because this is continuous with the abdominal cavity, and whenever the intra-abdominal pressure rises because of coughing, the pressure is transmitted to this sac, which is connected to the abdominal contents. This patient then, of course, once the overall nutrition and general health and everything has been stabilized, this patient will need a redo surgery, a big surgery, where all this hernial sac and the peritoneal sac which has come out, and the gut will contents which may be adherent to the inside of the sac, all of them will need to be reduced and returned to the abdominal cavity. Then the surgeon has to come up with an ingenious way of repairing this defect in the muscles and strengthening it with an overlay or underlay synthetic mesh, and hold that in place, and then close the skin again, and again the same precautions prevent coughing, vomiting, distension in the post-operative period, or any wound infection in the post-operative period. Guide the patient not to lift heavy weights or strain in the early post-operative period, and to such patients, wherever hernia surgery is done, they need to be very careful for the first 6 weeks after surgery, and still careful for the next 6 months, until adequate strength of the wound healing has taken place, and then only they can resume normal physical activity. So, with that, we come to the end of wound failure. And thank you very much. See you next time with your next online lecture in general surgery.